Um, we're happy again to welcome John Ging from the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, who I think has just been to Yemen. And welcome back.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to update you on my mission in the last days to Yemen. I went there with two of my colleagues, one from WFP, Emergency Director, and also from the World Health Organization. The reason that we went to Yemen right now is because we are very concerned about a seriously deteriorating humanitarian situation and the lack of attention and focus that the humanitarian plight of the people in Yemen is getting currently. Of course, we hope that the political process, the peace talks that are ongoing in Kuwait will be successful, and we can understand that that is the predominant focus for the international community right now, and we encourage that and we fully in support of that. But over the last couple of months, we have seen a shocking fall-off in terms of donor funding for basic humanitarian support to the Yemeni people. As you know, this is one of the largest crises that we have in the world. Yemen was an impoverished country before this latest conflict, and as a result, the people have had very little by way of coping mechanisms. So therefore, the effect of the conflict, the effect of the restrictions on access and also on imports into Yemen have been very devastating for the population. The figures, of course, give you some sense of the scale. Over 10 million people in need of our support when it comes to basic health care. The healthcare system in Yemen was and has been for very many years very limited, and now this latest crisis makes it even more difficult to get basic medical support across the board. And our estimates are that, as I say, over 10 million people are now dependent on the international intervention for very basic medical services. There are over 7.6 million people in Yemen that are severely food insecure. That on the international index of food insecurity is one step below the level of famine. So it's a very fragile situation, and it's a huge number of people that are in that status. Water is also a big issue in Yemen, with over 7.5 million people not having regular access to clean drinking water, and this has been a huge priority of focus for the international intervention in terms of the targeting that we have been doing for our work. Over 2.5 million people have been displaced by this conflict, so they are people who have had to flee their homes, leaving behind everything except what they can carry with them. In addition to obviously being food aid dependent, being in dependency for medical support, they also have housing dependency on international support, basic shelter, and other basic materials when it comes to blankets and clothing and so forth. The nutrition situation in Yemen is also very acute. From January to April this year, over 56,000 children were found to be suffering from severe acute malnutrition. We've only been able to, as an international effort, been able to reach 32% of those that we have been targeting. The total caseload of severely acutely malnourished children is almost 180,000. As I said, 56,000 coming into that status in the last couple of months. So this is a huge caseload of malnourished children. We also are very concerned about the plight of children vis-à-vis the lack of access to education. The education officials in the Ministry of Education in Yemen are now saying that over 1 million children are not going to school, and we know what the consequences of that will be. So overall, a very serious humanitarian situation for the civilian population right now. Protection from the effects of conflict. We are pleased that the intensity of conflict has significantly reduced in the recent period, but as you know, there have been thousands killed in this conflict, estimates over 6,000, 930 of those recorded as children, with over 1,300 children also injured in this conflict, so protection being a very big issue for the population. During our visit, we visited obviously Sana'a, where we met with all of the stakeholders and the various authorities de facto and the line ministries, the technical people who are working on the provision of public services, as well as our UN and international and national NGO colleagues and counterparts. Their big message was that they feel that this is a crisis that, although it is growing in its severity and its impact on the population, that it's not getting that component of the crisis, the humanitarian component, is not getting the international attention that it deserves, and that this is reflected in a shockingly low funding. The humanitarian response plan for Yemen is only funded at the rate of 16%. We have an appeal for 1.8 billion United States dollars, again reflecting the scale of the plight of the people, and yet so far this year, and we're coming up 5 months, and we only have 16% of the funding. I mean, we thank, of course, our generous donors who have so many demands on them globally, but for us in the international humanitarian system, this is one of 4 what we call level 3 crises, which are at the very top of the international index. So it has to get the highest level of priority, because we have categorized it as one of the highest in terms of its consequence on the people. Our mission also visited the city of, or the town of Amran, which is a place where we have also seen very large numbers of displaced people. So there are over 300,000 people who have been displaced into that governorate, and that has seen a 30% increase in the population of the governorate as a result of displacement. So as you can imagine, an impoverished area which now has a huge challenge to face with the numbers that have been displaced to that region. As I say, overall 2.5 million people displaced. We did also raise with the de facto authorities the whole issue of access and the need for unfettered access for humanitarian organizations to be able to get to the various places that we need to get to. I found those discussions to be useful and constructive, and we look forward to continued progress in being able to get to everybody everywhere in the country. We have a really impressive humanitarian team in Yemen, national NGOs, international NGOs and United Nations agencies. They've really been working tirelessly in what is a very intense and often very dangerous working environment, and I must say that we were all on our mission very inspired by their dedication and their courage. And most of all, we were, of course, inspired by the resilience of the Yemeni people. As I said, these people have been very impoverished for a long, long time, and now their plight is compounded by the effects of conflict. So we really have to say that they have endured way too much for far too long, and the overarching appeal from everybody that we met is for peace, and that's why everybody is looking towards Kuwait with great hope. But in the meantime, we also have to acknowledge that as an international community, we have to and we must do much more in terms of meeting the basic needs of the population while they are caught up in this situation. So I'll stop there by way of some general opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Evelyn?
Thank you very much, Mr. Ging, for that, for the briefing. I'm Evelyn Leopold, and I thank you again on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Saudi Arabia had said it was furnishing humanitarian aid. Are they doing that? Is it not enough? Are there delivery problems? And secondly, is most of the damage caused by airstrikes?
Thank you. Saudi Arabia, through the King Solomon Center, is conducting humanitarian operations inside Yemen, according to their reports. We are not, they are separate from the international response that the United Nations is coordinating. Saudi Arabia has given us funding for our flash appeal last year. I think all humanitarian organizations in Yemen, as in every conflict zone, experience access challenges because of the conflict. And that's something that we continue to work with all parties to facilitate. That's why I said that when I was in Sana'a, this was one of the most important issues that I was addressing to the de facto authorities there, the responsibility to facilitate our access for and to respect and ensure the security of humanitarian staff. As you know, we have tragically lost colleagues in Yemen, most recently colleagues from the ICRC as they have tried to do their work, being caught in the conflict. So again, that underlines the importance that those who are involved in conflict must place on the protection of humanitarian aid workers. When it comes to the damage in Yemen in terms of infrastructure, for sure the airstrikes have caused widespread and extensive damage to the infrastructure, whether it is to the housing or other infrastructure such as healthcare facilities and other facilities. I mean, this is very visible, the devastating effect of the conflict. It's not just, of course, the airstrikes. There's also a ground conflict ongoing, and you can see in the places which have been subject to that also the devastating effect on infrastructure. I mean, once again, this devastation reflects the senselessness of conflict. I mean, the inevitability that conflict must be resolved in a political process. In the meantime, pending that resolution, too many people are killed, too many lives are destroyed, and too much infrastructure which then has to be ultimately rebuilt. It is so senseless, and that came through to us from all the people that we met, the senselessness of this conflict and of all others, but in this particular case, a very impoverished people made even more impoverished by a senseless conflict.
Edie?
Thank you, Mr. Ging. I have three questions. On the 7.6 million people who are severely food insecure, what's it going to take for them to end up going one level higher and really facing starvation? How close are they? And I assume that this whole issue of funding is one that's going to be addressed very shortly at the Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul. Are you going to be doing any kind of special appeal there? And are there any specific donors who were very generous, for instance, last year, that have fallen off this year? As you say, obviously, there are plenty of demands for donors from many other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. The problem I'll take your second question first, which is on the current donors. The United States is now at the top of the list, followed by the United Kingdom. The United States have given 76 million, United Kingdom 54, European Commission 30 million, Japan 27, and then the Central Emergency Response Fund and the country-based pool fund comes in then at 23 million. It falls off then very rapidly from there. We received a large contribution, over 245 million, from Saudi Arabia last year, so they have not given us any contribution this year. So between last year and this year, that would be the biggest change in terms of source of funding. But the simple fact is that the base of donors is too narrow for Yemen. For a crisis of this size, we have too few countries that are providing us with funding. This does lead into the World Humanitarian Summit next week. One of the big focuses of the summit is humanitarian financing, and as you know, earlier this year, late last year, the Secretary General's high-level panel on humanitarian financing published its report and recognized that there has to be a very significant step change in the approach to humanitarian financing globally, given that the deficit of financing is over 50% between what we are appealing for and the funding that we are getting. And when we consider that our appeals are based on the very, very basic life-saving support, so we're only asking for the minimum that is required to keep people alive in these awful circumstances. A 50% deficit in funding really means a lot of lives are lost and a lot of human misery and suffering that could quite easily be mitigated is not done. The summit will seek to address the multiple strands here of the question of ODA and what member states themselves contribute. There are a lot of commitments have been made within the framework of the SDGs. As we know, 0.7% of GNI is a stated commitment target from member states. Only 5 have met that target. That is one area. Broadening the base around private sector engagement to support, again, financially the humanitarian endeavour, and other sources of funding, and a better way of funding humanitarian action is also very much part of the discussion that will take place in Istanbul. Trying to mitigate the needs as well, conflict prevention. I mean, 80% of our work is done now in conflict zones. These are all man-made. These are preventable. These are endable if there were political will. So there'll be a big focus on the travesty and the tragedy for civilians across the world, that there are so many conflicts which are resulting in so much humanitarian need, and there will be hopefully greater political commitment to end and resolve these conflicts. Addressing need also from the point of view of anticipating the risk reduction, a better approach to solutions, earlier engagement by development partners. This is also a big component of focus as well. So yes, humanitarian financing, the deficit between what we have out there as needs today and the means to address those needs is very central to the summit itself. Finally then, on your question about the impact, the fragility between those who are in an emergency status, in severe food insecurity, to then falling into the position of being in famine circumstances. I mean, that is what is giving cause, of course, for such worry. Because it's just one step away, and we've been saying that for quite some time. The Executive Director of World Food Programme has been on mission herself to Yemen because of the gravity and scale of the food insecurity there. That is some months ago that she was there and raising the alarm. This is why a deficit of funding, of course, is so devastating when you have such a degree of dependency on funding. If you don't get the assistance to the people, then quite obviously they will fall deeper and deeper into these other categories where they have no means to cope. So that is what is of great concern to us, is the fact that they have so little coping mechanism. Thank you.
Matthew, then Amoka.
Sure, thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Intercity Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks, as always, for doing these briefings. I wanted to ask about a particular aid convoy. The OIC put out a press release, I believe it's yesterday, but I got it today, saying that they launched an urgent medical convoy with the King Salman Center, and they say that it's going to the major cities in Yemen, and which they list as Aden, Laj, Abyan, and Taiz. So it seems like Sana'a is not on it, and certainly Sada is not on it. And I wonder, do you, as OCHA, do you think this is an even-handed provision of aid? Is this is this the use of medical aid as a sort of political reward for parts of the country that are under government control? And I also wanted to ask you something that wasn't answered here, which is, if you were in Amran, this was one of the airstrikes that has put the talks kind of on hold. There was a reported airstrike by the Saudi coalition on a base. They said that the Houthis had just taken it over during the talks. Other people say the Houthis controlled it since 2014. Stefan said it's not for the UN to say, but maybe it is. I mean, if you were there, did the Houthis take over the base recently, triggering the airstrike, or was it a strike out of the blue? Thanks.
Yeah, I was in Amran, and we did an extensive tour of the city to see the effects and to meet with people throughout the city, because it's not just the effects of airstrikes, but tragically for the people there was also devastating flooding and real terrible consequences for large portions of the population, because their housing was flooded, and many of the houses actually collapsed in that regard. I also went to the cement factory, where that had been hit by airstrikes, and 1,500 people who had been previously employed there were now out of work, having, of course, consequential problems. People no longer having salaries, then requiring humanitarian assistance and so forth. But in all of the engagement, this issue didn't come up, so nobody raised that question. So I honestly don't know. It wasn't in neither the authorities themselves nor any of the people said anything to me about this particular incident. So they didn't raise it, and I don't have any details myself.
Because the Saudi-led coalition said that they did an airstrike on the base because the base had just been taken over by Houthis. So you're saying you didn't see? I mean, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but this didn't come up. A recent takeover of a base.
It didn't come up.
Okay.
So I therefore
sure, absolutely. And what about the OIC convoy?
And then on the OIC convoy, first thing is that it's very welcome that the OIC, we've been partnering with the OIC, not just vis-a-vis Yemen, but in many other countries, and we are delighted that they are becoming more operational, and that they deliver medical supplies as they have set out in their press release to areas which are severely in need, is most welcome. I very much take the point about making sure that the entirety of the country is covered. It's important that we also, work with the various elements of different humanitarian organizations and their focus, whatever that might be. But I do also know that the Saudis have also supported humanitarian interventions through local NGOs in Sada. Quite recently, that has